So, Dr. Matthew Wielicki, welcome to the Freeman Report.
Thanks, James.
Right, Matthew. Obviously, I said to you that I'm sure we were spoken before from TNT, but it seems that we haven't. So I wonder if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself in terms of, I guess, why you're qualified to talk about the climate and whatever. I know you're a professor of earth science, but if you could just tell us what that means and what kind of what do you do as a job?
Sure. So, my background really starts in biochemistry. That's my original degree, and then I kind of shifted gears for my PhD and my graduate work into earth science. I was an isotope geochemist. That's primarily looking at isotopic ratios of old rocks and sediments, and it's one of the main ways that we know what the past climate of the planet looked like. Humans are a very young species. And so, for us to have any idea of climate, we kind of have to look at the rock record or tree rings, ice cores. We can get into those things. But I was primarily working on these types of older samples and doing the chemistry behind those, and then trying to see what types of things those would tell us about past environments on the Earth, geologic processes. That led me to a professorship. I was a tenure track professor at the University of Alabama in the Department of Geological Sciences. I was there for 7 years, but I really started kind of speaking out against some of the policies regarding DEI and kind of pushing back against the way that we were teaching about the climate. I felt that we had a very extreme kind of rhetoric in the way that we were teaching about climate. We had a very certainty about us. Science, if there's one thing that I've learned about science, it's that it's uncertain. And so I started kind of pushing back against that. And I very quickly realized that these were two subjects that in around 2020, you couldn't really touch. So I very quickly became, a heretic in the community, and there was just no room for me to stay in academia. So I left last year. And now I primarily write on Substack. I have a Substack where I write called Irrational Fear. And I've got a book coming out also titled Irrational Fear. And what this allows me to do is I'm not tied to any agencies. I'm not tied to any funding anymore. I don't have to walk any sort of ideological line. I can speak from my experience, what I saw in academia. I can speak to the science because I've published in these journals. I was reviewed a lot of these articles and these proposals, and so I kind of unlatched myself from academia and allowed me to speak very freely. That's been a little bit controversial, obviously, because when you're not tied to these things, you can push back a little bit more, and so
Yeah.
that's kind of where I am at the moment.
How do you feel about that? Because, I mean, just listening to you then, you're clearly, and obviously we had a chat before we started recording this. You're clearly a bright man, educated. It seems really sad to me that that you've had to do that you've been pushed out of science for being actually a scientist.
Yeah, yeah. We used to teach everybody to be skeptical. That was kind of the motto of science. But for a few of these subjects, it's just not there. The truth was, it was kind of easy walking away because I was raised. My father was an academic. I was raised on a college campus. I just saw it change so much. The dreams that I had when I was age 12 to do what my father did, it just wasn't the same thing. It wasn't this battlefield of ideas, and then we would go have a beer afterwards, where we would
Mm,
disagree adamantly and argue and give each other our points and really kind of give it to each other, but then go have a beer because really we probably agree on 95% of things, but we disagree on five. And it just became that we focused the whole culture of academia became so focused on our disagreements that even though we may both agree that climate change is real and it's an issue, but we disagree about how we go about it and maybe the role of CO2, that was enough not to just have disagreements and go have a beer. That was enough that I became an enemy. I was dangerous to the department. I was
mm,
dangerous to some of the students. And that was just an environment that I just didn't want to be a part of anymore. It wasn't what I dreamt it was. It wasn't what it was for my father while he was in academia. And so I kind of, I figured a few of us leaving, jumping on the grenade and exposing this whole thing will hopefully change it for those coming up the line. But being untethered to any sort of funding agencies or anything
Yeah.
like that really is freeing. I do miss the students. I miss the environment of academia, the college campus. But it is really nice being untethered and being able just to speak what I think is the truth.
Well, good on you. Good on you. Because the world needs people to, well, especially scientists, you know, they're supposed to ask questions, like you said, supposed to be skeptical about stuff. So yeah, good on you.
But it's
Now,
difficult, James. You go through graduate school for 6 years or something, and then you go to a postdoc for a couple years. You haven't been making any money. You're living on ramen and noodles, and then you get a tenure track position, right? And there's such a self-preservation instinct, right? I mean,
yeah,
to just not speak up. I was blessed that I had support from my parents, my in-laws. They were going to help us if we needed a little bit of financial support to take a different avenue. A lot of people don't have that blessing, and so I understand why a lot of my colleagues keep their mouth shut. So I don't blame anybody, and I hope people realize that it's a very difficult situation that they're in, but people are starting to push back, and it's just you can't really push too hard when you're young. What you see is a lot of the retired and emeritus professors who start to speak up.
yes,
The
yes.
young faculty feel the same way. There's just a big self-preservation instinct.
Yeah, of course. Like lots of things that have happened over the past 4 years. Matthew, we'll get on to CO2 in a moment, but first of all, I guess, do you think, I mean, look, obviously the climate has always changed. So, to ask if the climate is really changing is a bit of a silly question. But do you think the climate is changing in a different way than it has in the past because of human behavior?
So I think that local environments, we do have an effect on local environments. So urban areas are definitely warming faster than rural areas, for example, because we've dramatically changed the landscape. You look at a city, for example, like London, right? And look and think about what that would have looked like a few thousand years ago, right? Where it's grasslands and brush and trees and rivers, now is asphalt and buildings. And so the heat capacity of these materials is very different. So for a local environment, I think for sure we are changing our local environment. But if we think about climate, we think about climate as a global issue. We think about it as everything. We realize that there's regional effects and certain local climates will change here and there. But if we think about a global context, well, we know from the rock record and from geologic history that the climate has changed dramatically in the past. And sometimes that includes changes in CO2. Sometimes it doesn't include many changes in CO2 at all. For example, the Little Ice Age. So we've got all of
Hmm.
these past events that show us that the climate is a very dynamic system. It's always changing. There's so many feedback systems that we are just understanding. There's 100-year cycle, there's 1,000-year cycles. There's probably 10 and 100,000-year cycles that we don't even start to understand because we just don't have the real-time data yet. And so the climate will and is changing and will continue to change. The idea or the claim is whether it's unprecedented, like you said, whether it's somehow different today. The fact is that we just can't decisively say that with any sort of certainty. If we want to talk about the instrumental record, Central England has the greatest temperature record on the planet. Starts in the mid 17th century. The warming from 1695 to 1735 was 2 degrees in 4 decades. Modern climate change that we're talking about, that we are panicking over, is about 1.5 degrees since 1880. So if we just look at the instrumental record, then surely modern warming isn't unprecedented in central England, for example. Now, of course, to steelman the argument, people come back and say, well, that's not the globe. Fair enough, it's not. It's the one oldest instrumental record we have. And just conveniently, it shows that there was more change in the past than there is today. But okay, we'll ignore that it's just regional. But even if we look at global proxies like tree rings and ice cores, the climate is changing, and it changes sometimes really rapidly in certain areas, particularly in the northern hemisphere, because there's a lot of land masses. And so we're really in the northern hemisphere, the ocean currents are really important because the land masses are driving so much and dividing the ocean so much. If you look at the southern hemisphere, there's so much less landmass that the southern hemisphere is much less perturbed because the oceans are communicating much more. And so it's really the oceans that are driving the heat. But we know in the northern hemisphere, there's been dramatic climatic changes with little changes from CO2. And so, like Judith Curry argues that you mentioned you had interviewed before, we should be preparing ourselves regardless of the CO2. We should be preparing ourselves for climatic shifts and understanding that it's happened in the past. Maybe CO2 could amplify it a little bit or not. We'll get into that in more detail. But the idea, the way that it's sold now is go to renewables and the climate will be stable forever. And that's just not what the geologic record tells us.
Yeah, I guess so. So just to be absolutely clear, because when I talk to people, not experts, but just lay people, they seem to think that, yes, okay, you're right, the climate's always changed, but it's changing at the fastest rate that it's ever. That is what people believe, what they've been told, and what you're saying is actually that that's not the case.
So one way we can show that it's changing at about 1/10 the rate that it changed about 12,000 years ago is by sea level change. So sea level rise is something that really leaves an imprint on the rocks because as the waves interact with the land, you can really see these plateaus and these areas where old sea levels were. So we have a pretty good idea of how sea level has changed over relatively short time periods. When I was teaching this class, a lot of my students would say the same thing, but Professor Wielicki, the temperatures and the sea levels are changing faster than ever. And I would show them that 12,000 years ago, sea levels for about 4,000 years, from about 12,000 to, well, maybe even longer, for about 7,000 years, from about 12,000 years ago to about 5,000 years ago, sea levels were changing on the order of about 10 times the rate that they're changing today. 10 times faster than they're changing today. That's when we were exiting the last glacial, coming into what we now know as an interglacial period. We're still in an ice age, technically, because there's ice at the poles, but we're in what we would consider an interglacial period, where it's a little warmer than it was at our last glacial maximum, which was about 20,000 years ago. But so 10 times faster sea level changes with no change in CO2. The claim today is things are happening even faster, and it's all due to CO2. And you just can't square those two things together because it's not happening faster today. And in the past, when it happened faster, CO2 didn't move. So clearly there's other processes involved that are driving this. And CO2 it may be a player as well. Like I don't want to ignore it completely, but you can't pretend that it's the main driver of the system.
So in your view then, I think, and we had a quick chat before, didn't we? And we talked about the fact that you can understand why a lot of scientists don't speak out and are not more skeptical because their careers depend on it and all of this kind of, you don't get funding these days if you're a skeptic, right? So we understand why people go along with it, but where do you think all of this, what do you think is behind this then? Because, we're told that the science is settled, that it's absolutely beyond doubt. But I keep on talking to world leading experts who actually say, no, it's not. It's not. There might be a relationship like what you've said, but it's certainly not settled science, and it's certainly not beyond doubt. Why do you think then that the global powers, the UN and all these other bodies have become so fixated on CO2?
I think it started with the IPCC. So in 1990, and the first report, if you read the first report, even the first two, even maybe the third, you'll see that the language is very different than, for example, the last three reports, the sixth being by far the most extreme. And what you see is a shift from science, data-driven science, to what I would say is money-driven science. There was a huge amount of potential here to make an enormous amount of money because governments were getting involved, and climate, it's the ultimate web, right? It stretches into every aspect of every bit of the economy, of people's lives. it's the perfect tool if you want to get involved in every little bit of people's lives and of the government. And so I really think that when the governments saw it, the power that could be gained, when the corporations saw the money that could be made, there was a big shift from data-driven science to pushing a narrative, pushing an ideology. The the funding agencies got on board, NSF, the publications, the most prestigious journals got on board. Recently, Scientific America is more of a magazine, but the editor quit because of some of her ideological posts. But if you're a young academic and you have to publish or perish, that's part of 50% as a tenure
Yeah.
track faculty. You have 50% of your job is teaching, and 50% is research and getting external funding and publishing your results, because that's what brings prestige to the university. And if the funding agencies are taking an ideological stance and the publications are taking, the journals are taking an ideological stance, it's very hard as a young academic coming up to say, hey, I think you guys are wrong. Give me some money and let me publish in your journal why I think you're kind of wrong. So, the system just became so designed, but I think it really started with the IPCC and the amount of money that started coming in. If you notice, the IPCC used to be dominated by scientists. It's really primarily dominated now by economists, and a lot of it is social scientists, social behavioral scientists, because what they're trying to do is they're trying to change behaviors, right, so that their policies can get pushed through. And so I really put a lot of the blame on the IPCC and the fact that the science became politicized and weaponized so it could be made so people could make money.
And they are making an awful lot of money out of it. In fact, actually, just this last week, we've had a story in the UK. So the climate secretary here, Ed Miliband, is just signed off on £22 billion for a carbon capture and storage facility, which, as far as I can see, and I'm no expert, when this has been tried in other places, including in the US, it's not worked. What are your thoughts on these? And also the other thing that's been announced in the UK, I'd like to get your view on this, is this idea that cattle, cows, create 6% of the world's CO, or obviously by methane, but methane emissions. So they create 6% of the world's climate changing emissions. And they're giving them these chemical additives, which are cancerous potentially, not something I want in my milk and my dairy. What do you think of all this?
This is remarkable. So let's start with the first one. So what was the first one? Not the cattle, but
the 22
yes.
billion
So
pounds that
that's
yeah.
right. So it's remarkable about the carbon capture, because I think the day that he announced this, there was a report that had come out in a scientific journal, peer reviewed, that did an analysis of many of these carbon capture offset schemes and things like that, and essentially came up with the idea or the conclusion that these are essentially money laundering schemes. They do nothing to help protect the environment. They don't offset carbon at all. This is a way to virtue signal for corporations or for Bill Gates to fly his jet around because he says he buys carbon offsets. I mean, imagine that. Like, no, sweetheart, I know I cheated on you, but I bought cheating offsets, and so it doesn't really count. That when I was with that woman, it didn't count. I bought these cheating offsets. It's remarkable, and it blows my mind. It's just a way for very rich corporations or rich people like Bill Gates to virtue signal so they can continue to live their extravagant lifestyles while telling us that we need to stop traveling and stop flying and only drive electric cars. It's rules for thee but not for me. When
Yeah.
it comes to the cattle, it blows my mind. There's literally a report that came out just 3 days ago that says farms that have livestock and agriculture mixed are bigger carbon sinks than if you just have agriculture. That's because the manure helps to keep the soil very healthy. It helps to keep a lot of the carbon in the soil. And the companies that are pushing this Bovir, this additive to the food, they're the same companies that have invested hundreds of millions of dollars in plant-based meats. They have a huge incentive to destroy the livestock industry, the classic livestock industry, and push their plant-based meats, ultra-processed, terrible for you plant-based meats. Why are they trying to mimic a product that we already have, a product where animals eat essentially useless shrubs and grasses that we can't do anything with, and they turn those into essential micronutrients and protein that are great for us? That's upcycling. That's one of the it used to be the environmental motto was we need to upcycle. We should take useless things that don't really benefit us and find animals that can transform those things into things that benefit us. Cattle do that particularly well because they're eating things like grasses and shrubs that we can't digest, but then turning them into micronutrients that are essential for us. And the idea that they're trying to go after farmers and they're trying to go after the food supply when they have been claiming all along that climate change is the thing that's going to destroy the food supply and the agriculture. That's why we need to do all these drastic changes. But yet at the same time, we see that CO2 fertilization has doubled wheat yields, doubled corn yields.
Yeah.
The synthetic fertilizers we get from fossil fuels are feeding half the world's population, 4 billion people. So they realize they're losing there. So they're finding alternatives to go after the food system. I cannot believe that the UK is letting this happen when the company itself that makes the product is investing in and has a huge conflict of interest to destroy the meat industry. It blew my mind when I saw that was happening. That will never fly in the US. We will burn the cities to the ground if they try to do that. I can't believe you guys didn't.
Yeah, well, we're in a bit of a dilemma at the moment. We've just had a new government voted in back in at the start of the summer. They got in really because I think people were so disillusioned with the last government after COVID and everything. So they've taken it as a mandate to do all of this crazy stuff when actually they haven't got a mandate from the British public. But at the moment, we're kind of stuck with them, really.
Well, the consumer shelves look pretty stocked with that stuff, and nobody's
Yeah.
touching it. So you guys you're showing them with the pocketbook, and they'll get the message pretty quick, I suspect.
Yeah, interesting. The other thing we've got in the UK at the moment is a lot of farmer protests, which we've seen across Europe, because it just seems that, they're trying everything to try and make it impossible for small family farms and small holdings to be viable at the moment, not just in the UK, but the Netherlands, in Germany, and pretty much everywhere in France. Is that something you're seeing in the UK? In the US at the moment?
Absolutely. I mean, we're factory farmers as well. I think that there's big incentives for volume and for mono agriculture. I think that the small family farms are struggling here in the U.S. I think it's more economic pressures than governmental pressures. We haven't gone as crazy as some of the policies that have been pushed with things like nitrogen and methane in Europe so far. But I think that, yeah, small farms are definitely stressed in the U.S. pretty severely.
Yeah. And what's your view? Because you've had your own election, obviously, in the US as well. And I have to say that, I'm not a Trump sort of ideologue. I think he does have the propensity to say some stupid things. Not to say that he hasn't also done some good things as well, but I'm, after 4 years of the Biden administration, I am so optimistic now about what's going to happen in America over the next 4 years. How about you? What's your view, and what impact do you think Trump's going to have on the US, particularly in terms of climate policies?
Yeah, so I'm probably in your boat too. I would be one of his biggest fans if he could just keep his mouth shut a little bit more often. I think a lot of his policies originally were pretty good. I think when he told the UN and NATO that, hey, you guys got to step up and start funding some more of this, because right now you're just buying gas from Russia, and they all laughed at him.
Yeah.
And so I think, and the border policies were better, the economic policies were better, inflation was better. But I don't, I you know, I he was president when the whole COVID madness started. So I kind of take away from him from that. So, but I can't imagine another 4 years or 8 years with basically Biden policies. So I'm excited that there's going to be a push for energy independence. He's going to roll back some of the environmental regulations for energy exploration and development. I think he's going to push back a lot on the DEI stuff. You're already seeing corporations just basically dropping their ESG programs, that basically DEI for corporations.
Yeah.
They're just walking it back now. It's just like, okay, this is, and so just having him come in was enough that people just started dropping those things. And so I think those things were a huge waste of money. I argue that they made us more separated, more tribal, more racist, even because we were walking on eggshells in fear that anything would be taken out of context and we could lose our job at any moment because we said the wrong thing. So we just didn't interact. We just segregated ourselves apart. And so, I'm excited. I'm more excited for the people he's bringing in. I think there's some of the disruptors that are coming in are great. I hope that they don't just disrupt. I hope they do some construction, because it's one thing to just come and shake up the system. But usually what happens is the pieces fall back into place and you're gone 4 years later and all the bureaucrats are still there. And so you kind of got to shake it up and then redesign it a little bit. And hopefully they do some of that. But in terms of environment and some of the craziness of DEI, just him coming in and winning the popular vote, I think was such a clear signal to universities are dropping this stuff. So you're already seeing universities pulling back, corporations are pulling back. So there was a pretty good message sent for, I think we went a little too far in that direction.
Yeah, I think that's an understatement.
Yeah. I'm being polite.
And where are the public? Because although everyone says, it was a landslide, and he did, it is a big thing what's just happened. I think it's the first time in 30, 40 years that the Republicans have had, the House and the Senate, and the popular vote. So, it is a huge thing. But when you look at the percentages involved, we are still only talking about, 5-10% between Republicans and Democrats. So the country is less polarized than it was, but it's still fairly polarized. Where do you think that the American public is in general on climate science, and particularly sort of the Paris Accord and all of the net zero stuff, which we're seeing in Europe and elsewhere?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's definitely polarized. I think 5% is even generous. I think the difference was something like 3% total in the popular vote. But one fascinating thing was every county, I don't think there was a single county in the United States. That's how we divvy up our very small counting. So these are smaller districts, shifted to the right. There wasn't a single county that shifted to the left. And the counties that shifted the most to the right towards the Republicans were in blue states like California and New York. And so I think what you're seeing is that people are tired. I mean, it's like a war of attrition. They've been constantly told that the climate is going to change and it's going to be terrible, and they have to make all these sacrifices. And they've started to make these sacrifices. They're seeing that costs of energy are going up. They're seeing that the electric vehicle they're being told to buy is 20 grand more than the gas vehicle sitting right next to it. And then you got to put a charger in and everything. So they're feeling it in the pocketbook. And then they're going outside and they're going, I don't really see the difference. Like last summer was a little warmer, but this summer was actually kind of cold. And, I'm not seeing this catastrophe that I have to be making all these sacrifices for. So I really think people are getting tired. And the most tired are the Gen Zers, the youngest people, because they've been pounding this stuff into their heads since they were little kids. And they're just like, guys, like, you just keep telling us the planet's on fire, and we just keep going outside and playing and having fun. This isn't good for our mental health. We don't want to hear this anymore. We're tired of it. And so I think that people are just fed up with it. A lot of, especially the young people. So there's a big shift. It's slow because it's still ingrained in a lot of mainstream media. It's still ingrained in a lot of our institutions. But the public is really kind of over it. They're fed up. They don't want to make any more sacrifices. They're seeing the emissions in China and India and comparing them to us. They're realizing that Western CO2 isn't any different than CO2 that comes out of anywhere else. They're tired of being told that they're the enemy, or that, that they should be guilty and or feel guilty, right? And that they're the oppressors and the rest of the world is the oppressed. And it's just, people are fed up with it. So I'm excited that the shift is so pronounced in the youngest generation, because they're the ones that are really going to be the
Yeah.
future, and they're tired of it. They see the writing on the wall. They see people throwing paint on things or gluing themselves to things, and they just laugh. And so that's really encouraging.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I do feel sorry for a lot of the kids that are caught up in it, because they've been indoctrinated over the space of, 10, 20 years. The UN, for example, saying that, we're in a period of global boiling. I think they did us all a favor when they came out with that, to be honest with you, because come on, guys, you're overstepping the mark now.
Words have meaning.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
you're right. I have sympathy for them too. So I never want to, I try to always approach the discussion with sympathy for especially the real activists and alarmists. Because like you said, I mean, if you're pounded with this stuff since you could
Yeah.
read and write, and everybody's telling you the songs are about this, movies are about it, cartoons, you name it, I have the utmost sympathy. It really is kind of eye-opening too. And when I start showing them these things, they're like, this is like crazy. This is like telling me that there is no Santa Claus. It's
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
everything is,
Yeah.
I was so believing, and I have such a firm belief. It was amazing because I would ask my students, I would ask him a question when we first started in a class I called sustainability. And I would ask him, are you more susceptible to dying from a weather related accident or a climate related accident than your parents? And how confident are you in your answer? And they all said that they were more susceptible, even though they're like 90 something percent less susceptible because of technology and everything else. And they were very confident. They were 100% confident in their answer. So it's difficult to change people's ideas when they have the wrong assumption or idea, but they're really confident in that idea, right? That's a really uphill battle, and you have to kind of go slow with those folks. And like you said, I have a lot of sympathy for them too. So I don't want to,
Yeah.
I mean, I make fun of them a little bit too, but that's all just kind of in jest.
Yeah. And finally, Matthew, what would you, because I'm assuming, look, we are skeptical about the like I said, the money science, as you called it, that's been pushed in the past couple of decades. But I'm assuming you're still an environmentalist in the sense, well, like I am. It's not that, because sometimes I think people misconstrue when you say that, you use the words maybe climate hoax, or you say that I don't believe in it, that they just assume that you don't care about the world and you don't care about the environment. What do you think we should be doing in terms of the global environment if we're not worried about necessarily CO2?
Yeah, you're absolutely right that that's tends to be the automatic assumption when I start to speak out that, oh, you must be sitting back and pouring your oil that you just changed out of your car into your backyard, right, down the drain. And that's the exact opposite. I'm an earth scientist. My primary work is out in nature and sampling in the field. I drive across the country with my kids in a trailer because I want to show them national parks. I don't know anybody who got into geology because they didn't like the outdoors, right? We love the outdoors. That's why we get
Yeah.
into geology, and we want to protect it. And what happens is our focus about climate, particularly a trace gas in the atmosphere, sucks out so many of the resources that we lose focus. We lose opportunities to actually make meaningful impacts. We could make huge impacts in terms of the plastics that enter the oceans.
Yeah.
The vast majority of plastic that enters the ocean comes from a handful of rivers and a handful of countries. If we just diverted a little bit of the focus that we put on CO2 to that, we would have that problem solved in a moment. We could address so many of our actual pollution problems. I don't think CO2 is a pollutant. If we gave sub-Saharan Africa liquid natural gas so that they could stop cooking with things like dung and wood, we would reduce the respiratory problems in sub-Saharan Africa dramatically. We would save millions of lives. But because liquid natural gas is a fossil fuel, they say no. They say, no, 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 you can't bring them fossil fuels. We're going to pretend that they're going to build solar panels and then they're going to get induction cooking tops in their huts, right, at some point. we have real practical solutions that could save and help people and help the environment. But all we do is villainize the energy sector and focus on CO2, come up with grand schemes like these carbon offset things, waste billions, if not trillions of dollars that could be going to help the poorest people on the planet, and then pat ourselves on the back and say, look how we've reduced our emissions in our country.
Yeah, absolutely brilliantly put, Matthew, because I think, look, companies like Coca-Cola and all these other companies producing a lot of the plastics, the bottles, and all the other corporations, they're all virtue signaling about, we've got electric charging in our car parks. And, to me, it's all marketing because, the real damage you're doing, well, you're just deflecting the public's view from what you're doing there and saying, look, we're saving the planet with this CO2. So absolutely agree with you 100%. Matthew, Wielicki, thank you so much for joining me on the Freeman Report. You must come back again soon to tell me how Trump's doing next year.
Absolutely. Thanks, James. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.